Hello and welcome to Cymera, Britain's only book festival celebrating science fiction, fantasy and horror writing. My name is Anne Landman and I'm the festival's founder and artistic director. Right about now, I'd hope to be welcoming you to beautiful Edinburgh, to our venue The Pleasance, for a weekend packed with events. Writing workshop, panels, readings, open mics, a quiz, a ceilidh, 2 plays. We had so much in store for you. Thank you for joining us online instead, to be part of our programme from the safety of your homes. We're very excited to still bring you a fantastic lineup of speakers. We'd ask you that you support our speakers, and there's many ways you can do that. You can buy their books or borrow them from the library. You can donate to them directly via their Patreon or Ko-fi. You will find the links for that below in the description. We encourage you to buy a ticket for our events, even the pre-recorded ones. All ticket money will go directly to our speakers. You can also donate to the festival, and all donations via the donation page will be split between our speakers, once we've covered our costs like the Zoom account. Thank you again for joining us in this brave new world of digital events. We hope you have a chance to check out all 33 of ours over the weekend. Please let us know what you think of them. Do get in touch via social media, the chat function in Zoom, or drop us an email on info@cymerafestival.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. We hope you have a fantastic weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in person next year for Cymera2021. And welcome. Welcome to Cymera, Scotland's Festival of Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horror Writing. My name is Anne Landman, I'm the Festival Director, and I have the great pleasure to first welcome you to this event, which I have no doubt will be excellent. But I also have the pleasure of introducing our Brave New Words slot. Brave New Words is an initiative we run to support writers in Scotland emerging, or people that are using alternative forms of publishing or that we just think are really cool. So I'm here to introduce Ru Pringle, who is our Brave New Words reader for this event. Ru Pringle is a Scottish author who contributed to non-fiction publications about the outdoors, travel and science 2.5 decades since his first magazine feature at the age of 18, with published fiction including science fiction short stories in Interzone. He released 3 full-length novels in 2018, the dark future thriller October Song, and A Time of Ashes and Hunting Gods, the first volumes of the fantasy-tinged epic Fate and the Wheel. Today, Ru is reading an extract from his upcoming space opera City of Dreams and Dust. So please put your hands together for Ru Pringle.
5 years, 271 days. Resting on arms folded over the edge of the console, Wood gazed at the stars, wondering why he'd asked Tink each day to recite the duration of his torment. As the figures mounted, so did his quiet rage. The rage had no defined target. It was just them. Not only those who'd sent him here, treating his life with such contempt, but the society on account of whose whims he was bludgeoning away his existence on these whirling rocks. If shifts in the market caused the value of the metals he was mining to decline, he would die. The futility of his rage made it all the more unbearable. There was a way out, of course, one he'd considered often of late. Coolly, experimentally, his forearms were hatched with scar tissue. He suspected that what had reduced the pressure of the blade each time, angling it away from the vein, was thoughts of Tink. Both Tinker the man and Tink the machine, if the two were indeed entirely separate. Tinker the man would never have left such a mess for the next poor bastard to discover. Then there was the Tink whose brain lived in the bulkhead. Having known nothing but Wood's company, his fate, whatever that proved to be, would be suffered alone. He could be left orbiting this barren star for centuries. Tink deserved better. Not that Wood had been good company of late. Collection time. Cradling a drink with ice cubes in it, Tink lounged in a deck chair on a beach of white sand. His pressed trousers were rolled up, revealing unnaturally hairless legs, and his fedora had mutated into something with an absurdly broad rim, like a flying saucer. The sky's purple was mirrored in the languid sea. Wood studied the blobs of light central to the view ahead. In slow orbit around one another, there were 29 this time, to deny his jailers cause for complaint. He was good at his job now, and over the last year the asteroid field had shown signs of settling down. This installment had been collected with 10 days to spare. He fetched a mug of hot choc and returned to watch the familiar scene. Any moment now. As the thought crystallized, there it was, the familiar flash of light. And yet, he leaned forward, grasping the arms of his seat with unnecessary force. The hyperspace exit corona looked different. It was expanding more slowly than usual, which meant that it was larger, far larger, and nothing was visible at its center. He had to clear his throat to speak. Is anything there? A craft of some kind. Now holding binoculars, Tink's persona was replaced by a much magnified image of stars. Visible amongst them was a dim, fast-moving blob. Its dimensions are 3,080 by 803 meters. From its exhaust it has a fusion drive. It is accelerating slowly and must be made of something incredibly dense. It has a mass greater than all the visible minor planets. Wood clutched at the console. It felt as though blood was freezing inwards from his extremities. Artificial neutronium. He had the odd sensation of floating above his seat. Trajectory, he asked thickly. Where's it going? He already knew the answer. It'll miss us by less than 300k. Its orbital velocity relative to A5 368410 is negligible. When Wood spoke again, his voice seemed very distant. When will it converge with A5? That will depend on how long it keeps accelerating. If it maintains its present rate into A5's outer atmosphere, Mrs. Blob estimates 31 standard days. Scared, said the screen, below the expanding dark shape. Can we destroy it? If it's at max acceleration, we can intercept it. I have little data, but I doubt we can do much damage because of its density. What about deflecting it? Could we force it into a slingshot? Its mass is too great for our thrust to have a significant effect. And it'll auto-course correct anyway. The output of its thrusters must be insane. Can you tell if it's armed? It's just been me its product specifications. How helpful. It's called a Mark V Sunbuster. It claims it can launch 9 fusion warheads. Will our deflectors be of any use? I think we might survive the first missile, then the charge will be drained. So that was that. If they approached to try deflecting its enormous mass using a tow field, they would be blown apart. And there seemed little damage Oscar could inflict on a city-sized slug of hyperdense matter without destroying itself. Wood's head felt swollen. The hands gripping the console seemed like someone else's. But I've done more than they asked for. Why would they do this? The blob resolved into a blunt needle spanning the central screen. Its fusion plume had to be the length of a comet. Seen through deep filtering, it looked like a slice from a sun's photosphere. Stars beyond the control room were moving. Wood felt a tremble as Oscar's thrusters fought the tug of the Sunbuster's planet-sized gravity. At its closest point, he could read the thing's logo. Panspatial, his enslavers and erstwhile employers. This final touch of sadism, the murderer's name on the bullet that killed him, almost broke him.
Thank you very much for that, Ru. That was Ru Pringle there, reading from his work, and it's part of the Brave New Words, as you can probably see in the chat room, which is one of the things I especially like about Cymera. It's not just about established writers. We're also trying to do our best to make sure that we show off good new talent, which is always a nice thing. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second Cymera Festival of Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horror Writing. My name is Stuart Gordon. I'm a bookseller and a reviewer. And today I am joined by two very interesting award-winning authors, Anne Charnock and Adrian Tchaikovsky.
Hello.
Hey, hello. It's very odd doing this on online. We're used to doing this and then pausing for a moment and everybody looks at the audience. And of course, love the audience, to use in Nicholas Parsons' words. We can't see you. We know you're there, which is nice, but we can't see you. It's very odd. Anyway, educated in both the arts and sciences, Anne began her writing career as a journalist, with work appearing in the likes of The Guardian, International Herald Tribune, and New Scientist, amongst others. Her first novel, A Calculated Life, garnered a lot of attention and was shortlisted for the Philip K. Dick and the Kitschy's Golden Tentacle Award, which is no mean feat for the debut, I think you'll agree. Sleeping Embers of an Ordinary Mind brought further acclaim, and Dreams Before the Start of Time, which took a fascinating look at parenting, family life, gender issues and technology through several generations, won the 2018 Arthur C. Clarke Award, which to my mind is always the hallmark of a very, very fine bit of sci-fi writing. I always commend the sci-fi, the Clarks. Always a good spot to find some good suggested reading. Her latest novel is Bridge 108, an all too believable near-future story of a young migrant boy, Caleb, trafficked into illegal work in Britain, where climate change and other factors have exacerbated the many problems we see around us today. Best-selling author Adrian Tchaikovsky has moved from legal work into writing, largely in order to concentrate on ensuring that modern British science fiction and fantasy has a higher quotient of multi-legged protagonists than it previously enjoyed. Adrian, like many of us here I suspect, has a love of role-playing games, and indeed the RPG Bug World from his student days helped to inspire his very successful 10-volume series Shadows of the Apt. Adrian has penned a number of other novels, including the engrossing Children of Time, a multi-generational take on terraforming and devolution, which is fascinating, although perhaps not for the arachnophobes. Sorry. That won the 2016 Arthur C. Clarke Award, so we have 2 Clarke winners here tonight. The equally compelling sequel, Children of Ruin, followed just last year, and he is now continuing a run of novellas, including Firewalkers, which we'll be discussing tonight, just published by Solaris. And like Anne's Bridge 108, it also has a lot of elements woven into its future world, which are very much drawn from our own troubled present. So welcome, both of you.
Oh, thanks very much.
Thank you.
I'm flipping between screens here, and my notes are unfortunately on the same screen, which is a bit of a design flaw. Anne and Adrian, welcome to our virtual Cymera. Anne and Adrian are going to give us a short reading to begin with from their latest works, and then we'll have a little chat in the normal format that we do when we're on stage. And normally, towards the end of a live event, when we're doing this in the Pleasance, there's a bit where the audience can ask some questions. We're still going to be doing that, so you can use the chat function on Zoom to put some questions on there, or even think of some while we're chatting away. And we will try and get to those towards the end of the hour and see if we can put those live to them. Okay, so please do feel free to think on some questions, I beg your pardon. Now, the question is, Anne and Adrian, which of the two of you would like to go first for a reading?
I don't mind.
All right, please take it away.
That's okay, Adrian.
Yep, good with me.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Joe. That was great.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to read from a chapter, the 4th chapter of Bridge 108. There we go. In this story, a young climate refugee called Caleb leaves Spain with his mother and heading towards the UK. And I'm going to read a section, just a short section, where Caleb gets separated from his mother and is is trafficked to the UK by a young woman called Skylark. So this chapter is written in Skylark's voice, and it's just about 3 minutes. This is the last time, I promised myself, the last time to visit to the recycling yard, last time with Jasper and any of his clan. I should have quit sooner, but it's easier to carry on doing what you did yesterday. You know the ropes and the money's good. It's not easy money, but I've found my own methods, my own way of making the job a smooth operation. Take Caleb. Pretty much a stray cat when I came across him. He barely spoke to me when I first sat down with him, but he kept sneaking a look at my bike and sidecar. I knew I'd get through to him eventually. With quiet, nervous kids like him, in need of help, I do all the talking until I find something that lights a spark in them, and usually it's their pets. Do you have a pet at home? What's its name? That kind of thing gets them talking, because I've noticed that they miss their pets as much as their families. But with Caleb, I promised him a ride on my bike. Then slowly he started to open up, talked about his mum, as though the separation was temporary, as though she'd been distracted by an errand in town and they'd meet up later. He said he'd find her again if he headed to Manchester, because that's where they were headed in the first place. And all he'd have to do is find their compatriots who had already left their town and settled in that city. I remember he looked at me properly in the eyes for the first time and said, "It shouldn't be too difficult. We'll find one another there." All the time we sat together, me coaxing and him listening, sometimes talking, he pulled and nipped the left side of his neck, a red raw patch of skin below his ear. I told him he'd get infected if he carried on. And while I cleaned the wound, I learned little by little that he didn't have an address in Manchester or the name of a particular person. I mean, it's not my job to give him the wake-up call, and I shouldn't dampen his hopes. Didn't explain that any plans he had should be seen as long-term. He was awful thin and dirty, and I knew if I gave him to my Lexi, she'd build up his strength. When he was stronger, older, he could go looking for his mum and dad. There's no one coming or going in the yard when I park my bike. The recycling conveyors never stop, and the ruckus is like background music you can't shut out, or like a rookery in spring when the birds never stop squawking. But at least the sound of the conveyors is the sound of money being made.
Thank you, Anne. Adrian, would you like to give us a little taster from Firewalkers, please?
Yep, I'm going to go from right from the beginning of Firewalkers. So it probably doesn't need much of an introduction beyond this. So
Thank
let's
you.
go. So, the Massery Van Bults were coming in all the dry way down the Uguay Road, and as Hotep would say, there was much rejoicing. They came in a real motorcade, big cars with windows so tinted they were like black mirrors. The back ends corrugated with heat sink fins so that Monsieur and Madame and all the little Massery Van Bults could slide untouched through the killing heat of mid-afternoon. People turned out for them. As their fleet of cars grumbled down the Ankara's one-maintained road, everyone spilled from their factories and repair shops. An impromptu half-hour holiday from whatever it was put food on the table. The kids jumbled out from their shacks and shanties, from all the hand-built homes that had gathered around the anchor like junk washed up on a high tide, never to see the sea again. They all cheered, waving scraps of cloth for flags. It didn't matter the colour, so long as it was bright, bright enough to see through that dark glass. They whooped and stamped, all of them, and Nguyen Sun Mao waved and hollered just like all the rest of them, because this was how you did it at Ankara Achuca. You did it whenever the new guests arrived at the Roach Hotel, because this was the only time you'd see them. They check in, but they don't check out, which was some ad from long back. Anyway, it wasn't Roach Hotel, not really, not to the face of the people who got to stay there, however briefly. Not to the face of the Wabenzi who ran the Ankara town, controlled the jobs and who got fed. It had a fancy French name in 20-foot gold letters that loomed over everything in the township, just like the Ankara cable loomed over them and everything. Going up forever. The motorcade was approaching the big gate of the Roach Hotel now. The first couple of cars just went in, past the guards and the guns, up the gravel drive, past the dusty space where there had been lawns in Mao's dad's day, before the owners acknowledged that even they couldn't waste water on that kind of conspicuous consumption. Mao's dad had got to see the place pristine new before time and dust and the heat cracked the facade. Mao's granddad had helped build it, one of that wave of labour that had converged in all three Ankara points long back. They had locals, yes, but they got in strong backs and keen minds from all over, and it so happened there'd been plenty out of Vietnam who'd needed somewhere that wasn't underwater right about then. The crowd's jubilation was ebbing. For a moment, it looked like the Massery Van Bults were going to screw tradition and just pass through that gate from which no soul returned. Then, after 3 cars had cruised on, the 4th stopped and more men with guns got out, the private soldiers of the corporate compound noun that was the Massery Van Bults. And after them, some flunkies in suits, already pink and sweating in the seconds after leaving the vehicle's AC. Mao shook his head and rolled his eyes, but he kept waving his little flag because he had parents and siblings and they got hungry just like everyone else. They had little baskets, like they were giving out money for New Year, stacks of notes, a king's ransom. Sullenly, sourly, the flunkies began chucking the cash into the crowd, flashing the sweat stains spreading like plague zones across the armpits of their shirts. The crowd whooped, children ran up and down the line, gathering it all up. The Wabenzi would redistribute it later and plenty would stick to their fingers in the process. It would all go to buy just a little less than the last because even these good old American bucks, these sterling pounds and rubles and euros and rand, bought less and less of the less and less there was to buy. Children, because it looked better to the guests of the Roach Hotel if it was happy kids rushing around to grab their bundles of old notes. Because nobody wanted real desperate adults slugging it out for handfuls of cash that might suggest they weren't happy with what they'd got. Mao had thought the flunkies were it, but there was a special treat in store for all the lucky people of Ankara Achuka. Mao saw some kind of argument going on within that great big space within the car, bigger than the room he shared with 2 sisters and a brother. The flunkies were protesting, "No, go back, really, Mum, not appropriate." And then she appeared. A woman, white going on pink, broad-brimmed hat already wilting on her head. Her hair was like gold, like hair you only saw in adverts. Her sunglasses looked like poured mercury. She was waving back, basking not in the killing sun, but in the adulation, listening to the crowd go balmy because some daughter of the Massery Van Bults had graced them with a personal appearance. She threw something into the crowd, artless, awkward, but it reached the front ranks, almost brained some old boy, in fact. Not a wad of cash, this, something heavy. A plastic bottle, rich man's water, the pure stuff. The inside of the car was probably lined with them. There was a fight after that. The half-brained old boy had the bottle, his neighbors wanted the bottle, the people next to them, and then the gendarmes just turned up out of nowhere in their riot suits and were wailing into the crowd and cracking heads because this sort of unruly disorder before the eyes of the guests just would not do. And Mao was bitterly sure that the chief of police was going to nurse a long, cool drink of rich man's water this evening on his nice veranda, and that the old boy was going to nurse nothing more than a headache. Then he looked at the Massery Van Bult girl, and she looked so stricken. She'd done a nice thing, hadn't she? She'd shown the proper noblesse oblige, except it had all gone wrong, and now her day was ruined. He thought she'd actually stamp her little foot. But then she was back inside the car with her flunkies so the cool air could get flowing again.
Science fiction obviously is a very long history of pondering apocalypses and dystopias of all sorts, using the future to filter and consider the problems of today. In fact, in recent weeks, I think several times now, I've heard people remark that we appear to be living in something similar to a J.G. Ballard novel at the moment. I was just wondering, with Firewalkers and Bridge 108 drawing very much on pressing contemporary issues such as climate change and the vast and seemingly increasing inequality stratifying society, could you tell us a bit about what influenced your choices here and how you created the setup for your respective worlds, the environment, the state of the world, the economy, and so on for each of your stories? Which of you would like to tell us a little bit about that?
What you mean in terms of choosing to write about climate change or bring that into?
Yes, I mean, the background, we'll get into this sort of story and characters in a minute, but I was thinking maybe about, we could set the scene a bit more for how that world, the world that your characters are actually inhabiting, what it's like, and
yes,
what influences from today drove that for you?
Well, I've always been interested in climate, and I studied environmental sciences at UEA, where the climate research unit was set up. So I've always had climate on my mind, and I've Well, in journalism, I used to cover renewable energy technologies as much as I could. So I've kind of kept that as a subject always at the forefront of my interests. And then over the last few years, I spent more time in Spain with relatives, and also I went on a residency to southern Spain, and there I could see that a lot of farms are being abandoned for shortage of water. I mean, it's actual desertification in progress. And then my eldest son moved to live and work in a rural area of Portugal, which is prone to wildfires. So all this is going on as I'm about to start Bridge 108. So in a way, it kind of brings together a lot of that background that goes back, you know, quite a few years to my journalism days. But it's kind of more pressing now, you know, far more pressing. And it just seemed to make sense that with writing Bridge 108, I focus on climate refugees, not from far afield, but actually from the Mediterranean rim, coming from southern Europe.
Yes, I thought that was quite interesting, that the current climate crisis we've had between economy war and environmental crisis, the migrations have mostly been from Africa and obviously from Syria as well. And we've all seen that, and we've seen the mixture of heroic and horrible reactions to it across all the countries in Europe. But I was looking at your one, and I thought, when you decided to make it Europeans, was this a deliberate attempt to say, look, this is not just something that happens in faraway countries, this happens to your neighbours, this can happen in a country that's a stable Western advanced democracy. All it takes is a few bad things to go wrong, and this could be any of us that could end up in this kind of lifestyle. I thought maybe literally bringing it closer to home for a British audience.
Yeah, yes, I wanted to do that. I wanted to keep it within a culture that I understood as well. So I wanted it to be refugees from a country that was on a similar economic position to us.
Yeah.
A world that feels familiar. And also I'm imagining a post-Brexit world where they can't come to the UK. And I wanted to know, what would our citizens, how would they react to these migrants who, you know, we've holidayed with, we go to their country regularly, you know, how would that play out?
Well, it's funny, it's just timing being everything. But of course, in the last few weeks during the lockdown, one of the things we saw was some of the EU workers that had gone home, the ones they called low skilled, but still rather necessary because you need them to do the work. The ones that do the fruit picking and the veg picking, suddenly they had to fly some over in the middle of the lockdown to do that work. So after a campaign to get rid of people, suddenly it was like, oh, actually, we really need these people back to do these jobs. Thank you very much. And I was thinking of that while I was reading Bridge 108. It was just one of those things you're reading going, fiction and fact are they're becoming increasingly hard to tell apart at the moment. But it's also a sign of good writing on your part as well, Anne, to cover that. Adrian, sorry.
It's almost like the tables have turned now, because with coronavirus, continental Europe doesn't want the UK citizens visiting.
Yes.
You know, we haven't managed the situation quite as well as they have.
No, we have not. Adrian, would you like to explain a little bit about the setup for your world? I'm quite interested. You've chosen Africa, and it's, again, one that's been very damaged by the environmental changes.
Yeah, so, I mean, just speaking about writing about the climate in general, I think if you're writing a science fiction novel that's set any time in the next century and you're not taking into account some sort of climate disaster, it would be quite a remarkable decision on the part of the writer, I think. It's such a huge and inevitable thing that, you know, just sort of writing something set in even say 20 years time that isn't showing the fingerprint of that all over it would be a bit of an immersion breaker, I think, to me as a reader, if nothing else. So Firewalkers is set a little further on, and the world has gone considerably more downhill. It's set in Gabon, It's on the equator, and it's got to be set on the equator because that's where the space elevator cable is. There are 3 of them around the world. It's not all desert, but at the beginning of the book, you actually see one of the others in South America is getting destroyed by a colossal tidal wave, because obviously, when the climate goes nuts, as it is going to go nuts, it's not going to go nuts in a simple and predictable way and just get hotter. Other things will follow on from that. The only the Ankara, which is the anchor point for the space elevator, is the only place that people live there, and they only live there because that is where all the people with a lot of money get to go up to the spaceship they're building up above, where they can weather out what is happening on the planet. And so when we're talking about people going to the Roach Hotel, the reason they don't come back is because they're going up into space. Mao, the main character, and his 2 friends are firewalkers. They are kids who get sent out into the killing desert to fix things like the solar panels when they are not giving enough power to give everyone in the hotel their nice, convenient air conditioning and other mod cons. So yeah, it's a bit of a grim. It's interesting. When I was writing the book a few years ago, I got to the end of it and felt that with the narrative decisions I'd made, and not just where it starts, but where it goes, that I'd gone rather too far. And by the time it's actually come out, I'm now thinking I probably didn't go far enough. Because, I mean, it's about the climate, but it's also about the way I'm dreadfully worried we're going to deal with the climate, which is going to be this kind of colossal exacerbation of global inequality on national, racial and class grounds, and that's basically what the book's about. It's about the haves and the have-nots when things really are down to the wire, and what gets done and who gets left behind.
That kind of brings us nicely to one of the other aspects I wanted to talk about, which was the characters. And in both your books, your main characters that you're following are pretty much at the bottom of the societal hierarchy. They're people with very little or no power at all. They're pretty much at the mercy of all the people above them who don't even know that they exist or care that they exist, but nonetheless make decisions that completely alter their worlds. And I was wondering why you both decided to choose characters from that strata of society, in particular Anne. What made you first think to go for such a young boy with I mean, Caleb's what, 12 or something at the start of the book?
Yeah, I suppose there've been a lot in the news about unaccompanied child migrants, and that was weighing on my mind quite a bit. And I really wanted to have someone who's kind of at the bottom. In fact, most of the characters in the book are people who are at the bottom of the economic pile. I wanted to do that because I think we'd all agree that when it comes to climate change, we're all going to have to make adjustments. We're all going to try and accommodate it in some way, but the people who will have the very least room for maneuver will be the people with fewer economic means. So that's where I felt the main injustices would play out. I wanted to show a range of characters and how these big global events were kind of playing out in everyday life. So I felt by bringing in a climate migrant who's forming an important part of the workforce in this new economic order, in that climate migrants are being used as a source of cheap labor, and they're kind of turning them on and off depending on depending on how many workers they need, and they're working indentures to gain the right to remain in the UK. So it's in this post-Brexit world, they're being used as a resource, and there's this carrot of, come and work for nothing, and if you're lucky, you can stay. So I just felt there was a lot of interesting stuff going on there, in that kind of shadow economy, quite apart from the people who are doing, quite well for themselves in the more metropolitan areas.
Yeah, it's one of those things, as you say, where it's We're seeing elements of that today. And obviously there's historical precedent for it as well. I mean, the minute I see the word indentured, my first thought is, as someone that reads a lot of history, is that's how a lot of the colonies got going in the New World. It was, okay, you're too poor, you can't afford the 3-week trip over on the show. Tell you what, sell yourself into virtual, almost slavery for 20 years. At the end of 20 years working on John Smith's farm in Virginia, you'll be a free man and we'll give you a little plot of land or whatever and graciously allow you to stay. That's 250 years ago, and it seems we're still doing elements of the same thing. It's quite scary. One of the things I really like, Joanne, is, as well as Caleb, you're using first-person narrative, but you did this multi-person, which you alluded to a few minutes ago there. So we get to see all of the characters, and I found that very interesting, because if it was all from his point of view, it would be, here's the innocent abroad, and everybody's adult, they're big, they're scary, they all have power over them. And instead, we actually saw that a lot of these people, the traffickers, the people that are doing the work, they're not cackling villains, they're just people trying to actually make a living in a very hard time, and they have family lives, they have thoughts and emotions, and I thought that was quite very well realised from the way you did it. But I also thought it must have been quite a lot of stress trying to write it that way. What made you choose that form of narrative, and was it quite challenging to do?
To be honest, the structure of it and the switching point of views is what I found most exciting about writing it. Mm-hmm. That's what gets me up in the morning thinking, oh, I'm going to be writing from such and such a body's point of view. I didn't think I'd find it interesting to write an entire novel from the viewpoint of Caleb. And what I found I wanted to write multiple viewpoint, like a mosaic novel, so that I could build a bigger picture than a young boy himself, could put across. I think that the reader would have found it frustrating if they only saw the world through his eyes. And I'm not really interested in the kind of fiction that's about heroes and villains. It would be so easy with that kind of a book, kind of have the goodies and the baddies. And what I wanted to do was introduce new characters first through the eyes of Caleb and get Caleb's view of them.
Yeah. And
then bring in them with their individual chapters to broaden their story. But I wanted to show that they were they're all scratching along, they're all kind of perpetrators and they're victims at the same time.
Yeah.
Not like I want to excuse some of the actions, but it's just not as simple as, good guys and bad guys, is it?
Yeah. There were reasons for why they weren't doing this because they just wished to exploit people. It was this was all they had. This was what they had to do to survive themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. I find it very interesting. I also noticed that you had some characters where they're not entirely human. You have some of the better off higher classes of people who are augmented, so they now have even more privilege and success than other people have access to. Yes. And you also had Officer Sonia, who's now, I wasn't sure, is she actually an artificial person?
She's a fully organic simulant. She's kind of heavily genetically engineered, but also has cognitive implants.
Yeah, so, I did wonder about that one because I saw her, and when I thought she was artificial, my first thought was, is this Anne having a nice go at the fact that the bureaucracy tends to react to people in a faceless manner? I mean, you're talking about a child in this case, but it could be anybody trying to make a claim on social welfare right now. Yes. And you're treated as, you're a number, you're a statistic. And we all know that's not actually the case, because you're actually talking about, in reality, behind those numbers and rules, you're dealing with a person's life and their hopes and their security and their fear and their welfare. And I wondered if the fact that you had the case officer actually literally not being human and not being able to understand that, just following the rules, I wondered if that was a comment on how people are treated by the system.
It is. I mean, she's really super smart, and so she's cleverer than all the people around her. And she's actually worked out in her own mind that it would be far cheaper to just let all the migrants come in than have all these complex systems of channeling them in different areas. But she says even her colleagues can't understand the economic nonsense of what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's very much about people having to meet targets for the number of people working in the indenture camps. So it's that whole officiousness of who's allowed in, who's not allowed in, how many they need.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, as you said, people as a resource. Adrian, with your characters, one of the things I liked in there, you was nice, diverse range of characters with Mao and Lupi and Hotep. I like the idea of Hotep with her bandages. That was that a nice little mummy reference, was it?
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, explicitly so.
Yeah. So what drove you to pick these particular characters? Assuming, of course, the characters didn't pick you, as can happen. And
well,
how important was it to you to make a diverse cast?
I mean, we'll cut to the chase. I'm a white author, a comfortably middle-class white author writing a book about poor kids in Gabon in Africa. I wanted to get as far away as possible from any suggestion of a kind of a white savior narrative or anything like that. So you don't really get to see, I mean, other than the little snippet there at the beginning, other than Hotep, who's a bit of a weird case, you don't get to see Europeans or Americans or any of those any people from I guess my own culture, because it's not their story. It's not about them. And honestly, yeah, I think I probably go for heroes and villains more than Anne does in Firewalkers, and the heroes are definitely Mao and Lupe and Hotep, the kids who are on the wire risking their lives because some rich people want some air conditioning. It's and if there are bad guys, it's certainly not. Yeah, if we're in the book, we're the bad guys, I guess.
Well, I mean, as we sit here right now in a real world, we're all using tech right now, some of which was probably assembled by fairly young kids in a Far Eastern country that are paid peanuts. So we are all complicit, no matter how much we try not to be. It's just unfortunately the state of our global economy. But one thing I did find interesting as well, apart from the diversity of the characters, was choosing Africa, which obviously Equator, I understand, is obviously for a space elevator, it's a good place. But I also like the fact that you had the space elevator there, and it was putting me in mind of current Africa, where there are resource-rich lands, where there's a lot of mining going on for diamonds and other minerals and oil. None of that wealth really is actually trickling to the people around there. Actually, if anything, it's making their environment worse and making it poorer, more violence, etc. And I noticed when you did this, although the town round about the space elevator exists to service it, it's not really, that wealth that's not being spread, and I'm checking it. That was deliberate, that these people are here, but they're not making anything out of this.
Yes, and I mean, obviously the reason that Mao and company are having to go and do such a crappy job is because that's how you put food on the table. I mean, it's that old familiar artificial labor economy where you make people as desperate as possible, so they will do everything you need for as little as possible. And it's the reason we're not ever going to see around here anything like a basic living income or anything like that. Yeah. Because at that point, people don't have to do those crap jobs for almost nothing.
Yeah. Just to our audience, while you're watching just now, we're fairly champing through. It's amazing how quickly the time actually flies past. So we'll be taking some questions from you guys soon. If you have questions for Anne and Adrian, please think them up, type them into the chat window, and we'll see if we can put some of them up. We're going to continue just now, but if you want to think about some questions you might want to ask the guys, please do put them in the chat window. And in the meantime, we'll crack on a little bit. I was thinking about the kind of history in sci-fi. We seem to be endlessly fascinated, and have been for many generations, with stories about dystopias and the end of the world and everything else. I was wondering what you think is the attraction, particularly at the moment when we seem to be living in a dystopian novel, what you think the attraction of that kind of fiction is to readers, and also where you think your own work fits into that kind of oeuvre?
Do you want to go, Adrian?
Okay, I mean, I guess when I'm writing something that I feel has enough of a hold in the real world to be considered hardish sci-fi, which means that I'm not throwing in sort of the science magic stuff like faster than light travel or time travel or artificial gravity or anything of those things that probably can't exist. Then I feel also that we are bound to a certain trajectory of history, and I don't think I could honestly write a book set 100 years from now where everything was lovely, or at least not without having a fairly solid exploratory first act where I explained how we dealt with all the non-loveliness that is we're very obviously heading into. And also it's in a sense, dystopias and utopias have the same kind of function almost for me. If you're writing a book where everything is lovely, then it's because you're trying to set out a roadmap of, well, this is how we could get there. And if you're writing a book where everything is terrible, you're trying to set out a roadmap of how not to get there. Also, when everything is terrible, it is narratively much easier to make a story out of it.
Oh dear, there was one line actually in your book which I quite liked. I think it was when the characters had all been watching some old movies. I think it was a remake of a remake of a remake, and one of the ones they were watching was a dystopian film of some sort. And I think the line was something like, it was a film made back when the idea of a desert-filled world with ruins in it was somehow romantic. And it is. We have been doing that forever. We've been imagining this kind of ruined world, and we are endlessly attracted to it, and yet these characters are actually living in it, and they're watching a film from decades before when we had everything, and going, why were these people imagining a world like ours? And it is it is, why are we fascinated by dystopias, particularly now?
I suppose in a way, I mean, I think the obvious thing is that we want to see how bad things could get and then measure ourselves, you know, what would we do in that situation? Would we be helpful, or would we just look after ourselves? And in a way with coronavirus, we're getting that real world example of, you know, how are we as individuals responding in this pandemic, and I think that's what dystopias are about. And for me, I think what I'm interested in is where the personal and the technological and the political crossover. It's very difficult to separate out technology from politics and from people. So I quite like looking at how technology might play out and looking at intended and then also at the unintended consequences, but more kind of seeing how it kind of precipitates in everyday life, and say, well, you know, do you like the look of this? You know, a dystopia in a way is like offering you a version of the future that you can try on for size and say, well, yes, you would like to go in that direction with a few caveats, or no, you don't want to go anywhere near it. But I think dystopia has always been so attractive as well within YA, because of course, as young people feel that they are permanently living in a dystopia with no control over their own lives, being told what to do all the time. So I think we kind of grow up with dystopia, and it's something that's, you know, very familiar.
It is. I have had occasionally in the bookshop someone asking for suggestion for one of the teen readers in their household, going, they really like sci-fi and fantasy. Do you have anything that's not about a ruined world or the end of the world, though, please? And you have to stop and think, oh, actually, that's just taken about the first 40 books I was going to suggest to you off the list. I know YA does definitely love that genre. Do you have any particular favourites yourself in that line? Any particular favourite books?
I've just read, I could tell you a couple recent dystopias I've really enjoyed.
Yeah.
Well, one is Stillicide by Sinan Jones.
Oh, yes.
That's a really interesting climate change again. And then, of course, James Bradley's latest climate novel, which is Ghost Species.
Oh.
Yeah, that's only recently come out in Australia.
Oh, that sounds fun.
Yeah, there's a lot of good. I mean, the classics, obviously. You know, you've got A Handmaid's Tale. I mean, I can remember reading that soon after it came out and thinking, well, this is a bit fanciful. And then, of course, as the years have gone on, I've changed that opinion entirely. And it's like extremely plausible.
I mean, I've certainly read some very, very hard-hitting ones recently. There's Emma Newman's Planetfall series, especially the second book onwards, talk about a phenomenally dystopian capitalist world and how it goes downhill. And that's the way the decisions that are made and the thinking behind what's going on there seems to be dreadfully plausible to me. And very similarly in Claire North's 84K, sorry, not 1842, that would be weird, 84K. And looking at sort of a little beyond post-collapse stuff, I recently read Dave Hutchinson and Adam Roberts' Shelter and Haven, a couple of novellas set in England after a great catastrophe, where they're just at the point of starting to rebuild to agricultural communities and still getting it wrong and still making terrible, terrible decisions, even at that level. And it's all tremendously depressing, but they all the kind of the chains of logic these books set up are kind of hard to argue with when you see the decisions people are making around you now.
I think I recently, at the start of the year, read the new William Gibson book, Agency, which was a follow-up to one he did a few years ago. There was a big gap between the two books because halfway through reading it, things like Trump and Brexit happened, apparently, to go back and rewrite huge tranches of his book. But he has most of his apocalypse happen, it's off-screen. He calls it the jackpot, and rather than just environmental collapse or whatever, the jackpot is a rolling sequence. So it's the environmental problem, it's the economic problems, it's the societal problems, and it's as Anne was saying, these are all linked. You can't take them out. You couldn't do a novel today where it's only a disaster because there's a rising floodwaters or whatever. It's got to be. Yeah. You have to consider all of it, I think.
A rolling series of disasters just sound horribly familiar right now.
It's believe me, it seems like a different world when I read that back in January.
No, I also really enjoyed this the last few months. Helen Marshall's The Migration, and that brings together both climate change and pandemic.
Oh,
came out, before the current coronavirus, but it's kind of nicely balanced between dealing with both those subject matters.
I did find it interesting in the last few weeks before the lockdown in our bookshop. Roughly about half of the people that were looking for new fiction wanted escapist stuff to forget everything that was happening. And the other half were actually looking for dystopian and books about pandemics and infections or end of the world. It was very strange. Half wanted escapism, half wanted to see the end of the world. It's very strange. Anyway, see, we've got a question from one of our audiences here, from Ian. Ian, this is asking a question mainly for Adrian, I think. It's China has made much investment in sub-Saharan Africa, exercising soft economic power, and he's wondering if any of that factored into your influences when writing Firewalkers.
I mean, I suspect I suspect I wasn't thinking of specifically that, but certainly one of the things that Mao and company come into contact with is some sort of relics of the sort of techno dynasties that built the anchor cable and built the spaceship up above. Yeah. And the big family they run into is a kind of a Franco-Chinese family. So one of the things I was working there, the big divide is a rich-poor divide. And when you're that rich and you're in that very, very top echelon who are where you could get to make those global level of decisions, nationality isn't really a thing. At that point, and as long as you've got the buy-in for the table, you can play. And so, the rich, there's certainly a kind of a multi-ethnic melting pot going on at the rich end of the spectrum as well, just not necessarily the same with the same ingredients as is going on at the poorer end.
Yeah, interesting. Just looking to see. Oh, no more questions. You guys are being awfully quiet. You're all sitting at home. You should all be thinking up questions for us. Come on. We need more questions from you guys. But while we're waiting to see if anybody else has one, just maybe actually Brings us back to the writing world versus what's going on at the moment. I find it interesting talking to a lot of writer friends because
But sorry, Joe,
writers,
can I?
sorry.
In the Q&A panel, there are a couple of questions sitting there.
Are there? Oh, I didn't see those. Oh, sorry. Oh, my chat window has jumped down, and I can't actually see what other ones have we got here.
Can you read them, Adrian?
Yep, I can. So
yeah, mine's jumped down.
I have a question here from Suzanne Owen. What do you do if the real world becomes like what you're writing? Do you change what you're writing or try to finish as fast as possible to get it out?
Yeah, well, sometimes it's difficult, isn't it? Yesterday, I just finished the first draft of my next novel. And of course, I'm having to now reread it now in the light of coronavirus. So, I mean, I don't think we've had anything quite like coronavirus that's really making us have to review everything that we're writing. Because now when we write, if we're setting work in the future, then not only have you got to acknowledge climate change, then you've also got to acknowledge that COVID is a thing. And of course, we don't know how long it's going to go on for, if it's just going to be this year, it's going to be, or if pandemics of this sort now are what we're going to be experiencing all the time, the pressure we're putting on the natural world, if we're going to be getting more of these cross-species diseases. So at the moment, it's particularly difficult. But at least I think there'll be a broader audience, I hope, for speculative fiction now.
Yeah, I mean, it's so far I've tended to write far enough ahead that far enough ahead that the big things like climate change I can kind of take and do what I want with them, because it's such a phenomenally unpredictable thing anyway, that what I'm writing is hopefully not immediately nonsense. And the small things kind of vanish away when you're looking at, say, a century's time or something like that. But I've got my novel Doors of Eden, which is coming out in August, is kind of set now, but of course it would have to be either set last year or in at the very least a few years' time, because sure as hell all that running around and getting together in large groups isn't going to be happening. So I think the problem, of course, you've got is you're writing the book a couple of years before when it's coming out. So if things are happening while you're writing, then yes, you can make the decision to make changes to put that in, and you look terribly clever. But frankly, the stuff that you really get screwed over with as a writer is the stuff that happens after you have released it to the publishers and after the final series of edits have gone. And as we've discovered, the world can take some left turns frighteningly quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, relating to that, something I was considering myself, I see Shell is asking about how you both found writing under lockdown. I've noticed a lot of writers have been finding it peculiar, because normally writing is a solitary thing. You kind of self-isolate as a writer or an artist anyway quite often, but it's just been very different. So I've known some that I normally sit in a room alone all day, and now suddenly I'm doing it, but I have to do it that way and I can't concentrate. And some people have, on the other hand, have been really busy doing projects during lockdown. How has it been for you, particularly in regard to your writing ability?
It's gone okay for me. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I don't have young children to have to teach.
Yeah.
My kids are older, they're independent. So not a lot has changed for me. But I think what happens is I can have a good couple of weeks, and then suddenly it's as though I get a wake-up call, and it's like, where the hell are we? How, suddenly you just get this almost like a wave of dread of how bad is this going to get? But then, get that under control and have another good week's work and what have you. But I think it's been okay for me. I'm quite fortunate. As I say, no homeschooling. And I live on an island, Isle of Bute, which is great, but I can't get off the island.
Mm.
The ferries won't allow us off for at least a month. So, we're safe. But you know, it's a weird situation.
Very strange. How about you, Adrian? Has it affected your working pattern?
I mean, I normally like to get out of the house to write, but I can still write when I can't. And yeah, I mean, I think the writing itself has been fine. I've got a routine. I've been turning out just about the same amount as I would otherwise. I think, like Anne said, it's more the mental health thing that impacts. Weirdly enough, I also have about a 2-week cycle, and every 2 weeks I'll hit a real depressed low, and that's quite hard to deal with. And it's, although obviously it's informed by current events and other things like that, it's also, I think, just a purely internal cycle that wouldn't need anything external to just make me feel like that. And then after a little while it will lift, and I'll just plod on. Just very, very quickly, Shell Bryson on the Q&A has asked, will I be returning to the Spider books? And the answer to that is yes. Probably
good.
Getting pen to paper this year on a third one.
You should be a bit safer with that. There's nothing like writing something that's set in the far future on the other side of the galaxy. We did an event, the Shoreline Infinity people here in Edinburgh had an event one evening with Charlie Strauss, and he was talking about one of his novels having elements that was set in an alternative America, which suddenly became very, very close to what had actually happened in America. And he said, oh, you know, my next book, I think I'm going to go running back to space opera and set something 50,000 years in the future where anything that's happening in Earth just now can't screw it up. You know, quite understand the attraction of that. Well, we're coming up. It's just coming up to 7, so we're getting towards the end of our allotted time, I'm afraid, by the looks of it. Any last questions from any of you guys before we wrap it up for the evening? Last chance? Nope. It's very odd not being able to see the audience when we do that. This is the point where we would normally look at everyone in the audience and everybody puts their head down and goes, don't look at me, not me, not me. I'm not putting my hand up. Well, I think that's us coming to the end. It's coming just after 7. Thank you. Let's wrap up here. All it remains for me to say is thank you very much to Adrian and to Anne for joining us this evening. And thank you very much to the people at Cymera and Anne and all of the organisers there for putting together such a huge programme online. This is quite amazing that we've been able to have so many events today and tomorrow and Friday. I mean, it's I think a big hand for the actual organisers at Cymera for putting so much of our event on. And let's hope that next year we're all back in the Pleasance and we can all get to meet up in person. Okay. Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you very much, Anne. And thank you very much, all of you, for joining us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.